Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Abraham Lincoln, and the focus is frustrated commander. The year is 1861, the Civil War is underway, 11 states had now seceded, and Lincoln, as commander-in-chief, needs to get his army in order. He's called up a lot of volunteers, but he needs commanders. The commanding general of the army for the last couple of decades has been Winfield Scott, ever since his victorious stint in the Mexican War, but he's now 75 years old, not practical during an active war campaign. So Lincoln was looking for other opportunities, and one that he was considering was someone graduated from West Point, fought in the Mexican War, had recently been promoted to the rank of colonel. His name was Robert E. Lee. Lee turned him down. According to Lee, I look upon secession as anarchy. If I owned the 4 million slaves in the South, I would sacrifice them all to the Union. But how can I draw my sword upon Virginia, my native state? This was the common refrain of most, not all, but most of the officers in the American Army who were from the South. He took off that uniform and put on the uniform of the Confederates, and that's what Lee did. So Lincoln continued to look, and he settled on Brigadier General Irvin McDowell. He wanted McDowell to attack quickly before the Confederates could really entrench themselves across the region, and he wanted to quell this rebellion as quickly as he could. So he sent McDowell into the breach with 30,000 soldiers in July of 1861, looking at the entrenchments that the Confederates had put in place in Manassas, not far from Washington. Well, the Confederate line completely held solid. In fact, a general got a nickname. Thomas Jackson became Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall because he held back the Union Army practically like he had a stone wall in front of him. And then the Confederates counterattacked, and they sent the Union soldiers running back to Washington, D.C. This was a complete victory in the Battle of Bull Run for the Confederates, an embarrassing start to the war for the Union Army and President Lincoln. Slavery was inextricably linked to almost all aspects of the Civil War. Congress early on passed the first of its Confiscation Acts. What did this mean? It meant the Union Army could take rebel property, including slaves, that were engaged directly or indirectly in the Confederate war effort. But one American general went actually further than this. Out west, you had John Fremont in charge of the theater of the West, including the state of Missouri, and Fremont issued a proclamation that all slaves in Missouri were now free. Well, Lincoln balked at this. He was concerned on a couple of levels. Number one, he was concerned about these border states. There were 4 states left that had slaves that were not in rebellion. They did not secede from the Union. And Lincoln didn't want to do anything to upset them, so they might go over to the other side, Missouri, Kentucky, in this mix. And so Lincoln immediately ordered Fremont's order to be rescinded. But Lincoln had a second concern as well on the propriety of such an order. And he shared his thoughts in a letter to Senator Orville Browning. The proclamation in the point in question is simply dictatorship, Lincoln said. It assumes that the general may do anything he pleases, confiscate the lands and free the slaves of loyal people as well as disloyal ones. I cannot assume this reckless position, nor allow others to assume it on my responsibility. You speak of it as being the only means of saving the government. On the contrary, it is itself the surrender of the government. Can it be pretended that it is any longer the government of the United States, any government of constitution and laws, wherein a general or a president may make permanent rules of property by proclamation? What I object to is that I, as president, shall expressly or impliedly seize and exercise the permanent legislative functions of the government. This order would not stand, but keep this statement in mind, because a little over a year later, Lincoln would effectively repudiate this statement, and we're going to cover that in our next episode. In the meantime, Fremont remained in charge out west. McDowell, though, was out of his command, and in his place was another West Point graduate, General George McClellan. McClellan had also left the Army for a while, and he had become the president of the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad, but he's now back in. He's excited to take this on. But boy, he and Lincoln never got along from the very beginning. Just a month into his tenure, he wrote his wife and said that the president is an idiot. Seward is the meanest of them all. Wells is weaker than the most garrulous old woman, talking about a couple of cabinet secretaries. The president is nothing more than a well-meaning baboon. This is 1 month after becoming the commanding general. Abraham Lincoln and George McClellan would never see eye to eye. because in part, Lincoln, or primarily because of Lincoln, was concerned that McClellan never got going. He was too slow, always waiting for more troops to be available and always overestimating the forces of his enemy. And so he's always delaying, never ready to attack. While all this is going on domestically, Lincoln had foreign policy concerns as well. He was concerned that a European nation might come to the aid of the Confederacy and frankly completely change the calculus. The North had more resources than the South. That was to the advantage of Abraham Lincoln's northern effort. But if a European country would come to the aid of the South, that could be a very different dynamic. He was concerned mostly about France and England. France, of course, had come to the aid of the Americans at the time of their revolution the previous century. He was concerned they might do it again, and sure enough, France had an interest at this time in North America. But it wasn't in the United States, it was in Mexico. France and Mexico had been at odds about some debts. The French got tired of not being paid. They actually invaded, overthrew the Mexican government, installed their own leader, Maximillian I. This played out throughout most of the course of the American Civil War. France very occupied in North America, but no impact on the Civil War. They were focused on Mexico. So what about England? Now, England would be a strange bedfellow for the Confederates because England was the global leader in abolitionism to fight the scourge of slavery. This was an imprimatur for England all across the globe, but Lincoln was worried. And there was a triggering event that made him quite concerned. The U.S. Navy, the USS San Jacinto, under the command of Captain Charles Wilkes, captured a British mail packet, the RMS Trent, and on board were a couple of ministers from the Confederacy going to Europe to try to get some support. Now, the northern press and northern population were thrilled. What a great showing by the American Navy, stopping this in its tracks. But Lincoln was concerned that the British would take offense to the Americans capturing one of their vessels, regardless of the circumstances. He immediately ordered everything to be released. He didn't want England to have any reason to get involved in the war, and sure enough, they did not. Secretary Seward and President Lincoln were successful. No nation gave any material support to the Confederates. This would be an all-American affair. Well, Lincoln continued to be frustrated not only with his General McClellan, but also General Buell, who was slow to engage in his area of eastern Tennessee. He was frustrated with Henry Halleck, who was in charge of Missouri now. They decided to make a change, not with his generals, but with his Secretary of War. Simon Cameron was out. Cameron got a soft landing. Lincoln gave him the opportunity to be the minister to Russia, but he wanted someone who was going to be more no-nonsense and more aggressive, and for that, he found his man in Edwin Stanton. Stanton had been the Attorney General for James Buchanan just before Lincoln took office, and he had actually been advising Cameron behind the scenes. He, again, was a no-nonsense guy, didn't care what anybody thought about him. He was very aggressive. That's what Lincoln wanted, and that's what Lincoln got with Edwin Stanton. January of 1862 now. Lincoln is tired of waiting. He said to his cabinet that if something were not done soon, the bottom would be out of the whole affair. And if General McClellan did not want to use the army, he'd like to borrow it, provided he could see how it could be made to do something. And he issued General Order Number 1. General Order Number 1 ordered McClellan to attack no later than February the 22nd. Happened to be George Washington's birthday. Now, McClellan was ill at the time when this order came out, but when he was healthy, he did respond and got his men ready to attack. He missed the deadline, but not by much. The problem was the whole engagement was a disaster. His goal was to cross the Potomac to engage the Confederates at Harper's Ferry, right across the river. And he set two bridges across, one a pontoon bridge that worked just fine. The other was a more permanent bridge, a connection via canal boats, which completely failed. Why? Because the lift lock they acquired was too narrow, and they couldn't get the contraption to work with the canal boats that they had acquired. The entire engagement had to be aborted, and Lincoln was beside himself at the incompetence. He said, "I am almost despairing at these results. Everything seems to fail." One exception, one general, one location out west. Brigadier General Ulysses Grant, another West Point graduate, who had left the Army, been out for about 6 years, had come back in when the war started. He put in a campaign to capture a couple of forts on the Kentucky-Tennessee border, Forts Henry and Donelson, and it was a major success. 14,000 Confederates surrendered as he captured both forts. This was critical to keeping the Confederates out of Kentucky, helping to keep them neutral, and opening up the passageways by river into the state of Tennessee. Lincoln was thrilled. He liked the aggression. Ulysses Grant is someone that Lincoln would keep his eye on. Tragedies abounded during the Civil War on all places across the country, including within the White House. Now, unrelated to the war effort, a tragedy occurred. 11-year-old Willie Lincoln got sick. This is February of 1862. Mary and Abraham Lincoln, his parents, gave constant vigils, but it didn't work. By February the 20th, Willie Lincoln died. The First Lady was inconsolable and really something from which she almost never recovered. Lincoln was also deeply affected by the loss of his son, but he didn't have time to mourn. He had to go back to work given the peril that the country was in. Robert Lincoln, their oldest son, was away at Harvard, so he wasn't around, leaving Lincoln with just one of his children left in the White House, and that was 7-year-old Tad. Lincoln and Tad became very close, almost constant companions throughout the balance of Lincoln's term in the White House. McClellan is finally ready for his big push. The fight he wanted to take wasn't at the soldiers in and around Washington, D.C. He wanted to go after the capital of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia. Now, Lincoln was less concerned about capturing cities. He wanted to degrade the war effort, and he thought that would mean you attack armies, not cities. But in the end, he agreed with McClellan's plan. McClellan took 100,000 men. He was going to go up the York and the James Rivers, capture Richmond. Well, the Confederate defenses were incredibly stout, and McClellan got bogged down in Yorktown for about a month, and Lincoln was urging him to go forward, writing him, and once more, let me tell you, it is indispensable to you that you strike a blow. You must act. That was Lincoln's message. Well, he finally attacked, getting out of Yorktown, but by then, the Confederates had actually given up those works. They re-entrenched in an even more stout defensive line a little bit closer to Richmond that McClellan simply was unable to penetrate. Lincoln even took Secretary Stanton and Chase with him down to the location of McClellan's headquarters to urge him to continue to attack. It was to no avail. He couldn't break through. The Confederates then attacked. The 7 days battle occurred, and eventually McClellan and his men were kicked out of the region, heading back to the safety of the northern lines. The Peninsula Campaign was over, and so were the days of George McClellan in command of the Union Army. Lincoln made a change. He went with Henry Halleck as his new commander-in-chief, and he was thinking about making some other changes as well. That topic of slavery back on his mind in his context as commander-in-chief. We're going to talk about that in our next episode. For now, that is Abraham Lincoln and a frustrated commander from the life of Abraham Lincoln. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.